Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Welcome to the messengers in our home. Hello, dear Kardec Radio listeners, and welcome to another chapter of the messengers in our home. Tonight we're going to talk about Acelino's tragedy, chapter number 8. Hello, Mackenzie.
Hi, Francisca. And hello, everyone. Welcome back to another chapter of the messengers in our home.
So, before we start, we would like to invite you for our opening prayer. Dear Mother, Father God, Creator of the universe and of all things, we praise you for your love and justice and the greatness of your creation. We thank you so much for the many blessings we receive every day in our lives, even those we don't identify as such. We are grateful for being gathered once more here at Kardec Radio in order to study more about the preparation we've been through in the spirit world and how we live our lives right now. We're really grateful to Chic Xavier and Andre Louis for bringing us this series of life in the spirit world and the many lessons for all of us, including the example of Acelino. We also would like to welcome the spirit benefactors of Kardec Radio, thanking them for their constant support and for being with each one of us who are listening to this program live or on demand later on, inspiring us with good thoughts and impulses to improve ourselves and our lives. And with your permission, we would like to start our meeting. So be it. So let us now listen to the reading of chapter 8. Enjoy.
Chapter 8. Acelino's Tragedy. I was going to speak some more with Otávio, but someone approached and said to the ex-medium in a firm voice, "Don't cry, dear fellow. You haven't been forsaken. Besides, you can count on your mother's devotion. I'm in a much worse situation, but even so, I'm not without hope. We are spiritually impoverished, that's obvious. However, we must wait confidently for a new loan of opportunity from the divine treasury. God is not poor." I was startled and turned around, but did not recognize the newcomer. Dona Isaura politely introduced us. It was Acelino, who had had the same sort of experience as Otávio. Noticing his sadness, Otávio smiled and replied, "I'm not a criminal in the world's eyes, but I am a failure in God's and Nosso But let's be reasonable," replied Acelino, seeming more upbeat. "You lost the match because you didn't even play, whereas I lost it by playing disastrously. I went through 11 years of torment in the lower zones. Your situation didn't demand such drastic measures. Even so, I trust in Providence." Vicente interrupted. "Each one of us has had to experience what was appropriate for him. Not everyone succeeds in their trials on earth. And turning to me specifically, he explained, as doctors, how many of us have failed regretfully in a struggle? After agreeing and recalling my own case, I countered, nevertheless, it would be very interesting to hear about Acelino's experience. Did he suffer the same misfortune as Otavio? I believe that delving into these lessons is very worthwhile. While incarnate, I didn't have a good grasp on spiritual duty, but here my perspective has changed. We have to think about our eternal future. Acelino smiled and replied, my story is quite different. My downfall displays different characteristics, and from my point of view, was much more serious. In meeting our expectations, he began. I too left No Solar during the last century after receiving the invaluable instructive heritage of our advisors. I went on my way enriched with blessings. One of our distinguished ministers in communication presided personally over the measures related to my new task. There was no lack of resources to enable me to enjoy both bodily health and mental stability. After making a number of promises to our superiors, I left to serve our colony in one of the large cities of Brazil. Marriage was on my itinerary, and Ruth, my devoted companion, took it upon herself to work with me to accomplish our tasks more easily. After finishing the first part of the plan at age 20, I was called to mediumistic work and received tremendous support from invisible benefactors. I still remember the sincere satisfaction of my colleagues in our study group. The clairvoyant, clairaudient, and psychographic faculties that the Lord had granted me out of His mercy were decisive factors for our work to be successful. Everyone was filled with unsurpassable joy. However, in spite of wonderful lessons regarding evangelical love, I was inclined to turn my faculties into a source of material income. I wasn't willing to wait for the abundant financial resources that the Lord was going to send me after I had proven myself, and I looked to solve my own financial problems. Wasn't my work the same as others? Weren't Catholic priests paid for their spiritual and religious work? If we all had to pay for the needs of the body, why shouldn't we be paid for providing for the needs of the soul? My friends were ignorant of the sacred nature of faith, and so they went along with my selfish conclusions. We believed that discarnates were behind the essence of our work, but still, my personal collaboration as an intermediary was part of it, for which payment would be appropriate. My spirit friends rushed to point out a better way, but to no avail. In vain, my incarnate friends demanded an explanation. I clung to my inferior interests and stuck to my own point of view. I would work only for paying clients. I decided to charge for consultations with special rates for the poor and unfortunate. My consultation room filled up with people. Great interest was aroused among those desiring to improve their health and find solutions to their material affairs. A large number of wealthy families took me on as their regular consultant for all their life problems. Lessons regarding higher spirituality, friendly fellowship, redemptive work for the gospel, and teachings by divine emissaries were left along the wayside. The school of virtue, fraternal love, and higher edification no longer counted. Instead, business competition, legal or criminal relationships, passionate whims, police cases, and a grand procession of humankind's miseries in their least worthy expressions were what mattered. The landscape of the spirit world encircling me had been completely transformed. By surrounding myself with criminals for monetary gain, the inferior mental currents of my troubled clients had incarcerated me in a dark psychic dungeon. I even committed the crime of ridiculing the gospel of our Lord Jesus, overlooking the fact that illicit business dealings with those who have corrupt scruples also entail involvement with evil spirits, who, on the invisible planes, show an interest in such dealings. I had transformed mediumship into a source of material hunches and cheap advice. Just then, our storyteller's eyes suddenly turned red, revealing unfathomable horror in their pupils, as if he were reliving an atrocious torment. But death came, my friends, and tore me from my delusion. At the moment of that great transition, the dark troop of criminal clients who had preceded me to the grave surrounded me, demanding suggestions and guidance of a lower nature. They wanted news about incarnate accomplices and business results, and they demanded solutions regarding clandestine connections. I screamed, wept, implored, but I was shackled to them by sinister mental chains because of my negligence in defending my spiritual heritage. For 11 years, I expiated my wrongdoings among them amidst remorse and bitterness. Acelino fell silent, and judging from his abundant tears, seemed even more distraught. Deeply touched, Vicente said, "Come now, don't beat yourself up like that. You didn't commit any murders, nor did you nourish any deliberate intentions to spread evil. The way I see it, you too deceived yourself like so many of us." Acelino dried his tears and replied, "No, I wasn't a murderer or a common thief. I had no inner desire to hurt anyone, nor did I disrespect the homes of others, but I went to the physical realm to serve God's creatures, our brothers and sisters, alongside Jesus, in order to help them with their spiritual growth. But I only made addicts of religious belief and occult delinquents who were mutilated in their faith and crippled in their thought. I have no excuse, because I knew better. I can't be forgiven, for I didn't lack divine assistance." And after a long pause, he concluded gravely, "Now, can you see how guilty I am?" So as we've been saying, these next few chapters, including the chapter that we had last week, we're going to talk about different experiences on the lives of certain spirits that they went through after they incarnated, and they're going to tell parts of their stories so that we can see how they behaved, what did they do, and what were the consequences of their actions. And today is not different. Today we're talking about Acelino and what happened to him, not only while he was incarnated, and to some extent what happened to him after he discarnated, and why he is in the situation that he is at that very moment, talking to Andre, to Vicente, to Otavio, and so on. So we remember that last week Otavio was telling his story, and his mother and another woman was there with them, together with Andre, Vicente, and so on. And he was talking about what happened for his downfall and why he was crying, why he was suffering, and so on. So that's how this chapter starts. It's following that conversation. Andre says that he was about to speak some more with Otavio, but someone that he didn't know approached and said, talking specifically at this moment to Otávio, and tells him, advises him so that he doesn't cry, because he was not abandoned, he was not forsaken. And even further, saying that, okay, you can still count on your mother's devotion. So you're here, you're with us, so you don't need to cry. But then he says, I am in a much worse situation. But even so, even being in a much harder situation than you are, I am not without hope. So this is very interesting, because as we are going to talk about in a few minutes about Acelino's name, about the meaning of the name Acelino, he starts by, to some degree, agreeing, but at the same time disagreeing with why Otávio is suffering so much, as if he is still dealing with something inside of himself. So Acelino is really struggling with how he feels and with what he did with his own life. So, but he agrees with Otávio's story, saying, okay, you suffered, you did something that I can agree with you that was bad, but however, on my point of view, my situation is much worse than yours. But even so, I am not without hope. What I like to think about Acelino, and I said that before, is that these spirits are clearly on the same level that we are. So at this very moment, Acelino is a quote-unquote here regular spirit, a spirit who is dealing with his own wrongdoings, remembering his past, thinking about what did I do wrong, how can I do better, and I still have a lot of things inside of me that really need to be reworked, which is very, very different than, for example, André Luiz's mother, than one of those ministers of communication, of even some of those nurses, for example, Narcisa, for example, Tobias himself, although we can clearly see that Tobias is also closer to us, but Clarencio, Minister Genesio. So Acelino is a regular man, is a regular human being, still struggling with a lot of difficulties inside of them. So we can see how different are the advices or the stories that they are telling from the stories and the advices that Minister Veneranda, for example, tell us. So it is for us to really, really try to relate with those spirits, because we are struggling like them. And what Acelino is showing us here, that even though you can be in a bad situation, there's always, or there can always be somebody who is in a worse situation than us. And we look at some of those people when we see that they have hope for their own lives, and that they keep fighting their own lives, right? Struggling, but clearly having that hope that everything will be better. It's for us to understand and put that teaching into our own lives and be more hopeful. But he goes on and he says that, and here's when we start to see how interesting these people, because remember, we are reading a story and we may tend to see or tend to believe that these characters here were created from the mind of a person, were creation, were a character, a fictional character. But no, these are true stories. The names are changed to preserve the spirits and the people involved in the stories, but the stories are real. So we can clearly see how the personality of these spirits show up with the choice of words that they use here. So what is the problem? What is Acelino's problem? What is Acelino's tragedy? It's linked to the importance that he puts into the material riches, right? Into monetary gain. And look how he talks to us, or at that moment specifically talking to Otavio, but talking to us, right? Nevertheless, look at the choice of words that he used at the end of this, his first, when he first appears in the story. He says, we are spiritually impoverished. And we are, right? We're still learning. We are still grasping the ideas. We are still enriching ourselves with God's gold, right? With the gold here being the representation of monetary gains, but God's gold is not physical, it's spiritual, it's God's love. So his choice of words, it tells us a lot about himself. So we are spiritually impoverished, that's obvious. And he goes on, however, we must wait confidently for a new loan. So loan of opportunity from the divine treasury. So see, the words loan, that clearly relates to a rent, to something that we need to pay to have for a certain amount of time, right? From the divine treasury. And he says, God is not poor. So even if we don't know what Acelino's story is going to be about, we can clearly see how he thinks, how he relates to the world, and how he looks at things. And that shows not a bad sign. It's not a bad sign because these are metaphors, and we can clearly understand what he wants us to understand here. He wants us to see here. He's making these connections with our day-to-day lives. These are words, these are meanings, and some things that we need on our day-to-day lives, right? We all rent houses, or we all have mortgages. We all have to pay for the cars that we need, for the food, and we have to loan sometimes money so that we can, if we don't have, for example, the money to buy a car, we have to be repaying that loan from monthly payments and so on. So it's something that we live. It's something that we need. And once we see these metaphors, we can understand when we relate these metaphors to God, to the eternal life, to the spiritual life, we can clearly or more clearly understand what he's talking about, what Jesus is talking about. Jesus himself, right? He uses metaphors related with money, with gold, with material riches, and so on and so forth. So, but it is very interesting to see how Acelino's mind works at this moment. And since we all read the chapter, we know what was his main problem when he was incarnated. So maybe that's why it's so easy for him to use these words to make these connections here. And once Andre heard this, he says he was startled, he turned around, he didn't recognize the man, and then Isaura introduced Acelino to them all. And we remember, right, Isaura is Otavio's mother, who is still there around the conversation, and that's when we know his name, or Andre mentions his name for the first time in the narrative, right? It was Acelino who had the same sort of experience as Otavio. So the same sort we can understand in a few different ways. It may be something with mediumship. It was a downfall. It was a tragedy. And as we said, we already know what it was. But let's move on. And Andre then says that he notices that Otavio was saddened, or was sad, but he tried and he smiled. Otavio smiled and replied that he was not a criminal. He is not a criminal in the world's eyes, which is also very interesting, right? So he's looking at himself and looking at the world and noticing that nobody on the exterior world will notice him as a criminal, because what he did was not wrong in the world's eyes. If much, the world would see him as a very unfortunate man for having chosen a woman that was not probably to his, as he says, right, in that chapter, of a different level in spirituality and have, I don't know, maybe broken him down, but it was his choice, and we always need to remember that. Also, at that time, and unfortunately still these days, men tend to believe that when they marry or when they have women, they are at their disposal. And of course it is not, right? This time is for us to really reflect upon, we are all human beings. Nobody is at the disposal of others for what they want or what they think they need. And maybe at that time, society in the world's eyes, as he is saying here, would see his choice and his choices of maybe going out with different women and doing whatever he pleased. So at the end, we saw last week that he died with syphilis and a lot of other problems. So he was not using his sexuality in a healthy way. He was really abusing his sexuality and going into very, very weird liaisons with different types of women. And not that the women are the cause of this, it's himself. He was the one choosing to go the path that he went to. So, however, when he looks back with a different set of eyes, with no solars in God's eyes, right, he sees that he was a failure, because there were a lot of moments in his life where people were saying, and the teachings that he was getting were telling him, teaching him, don't go that path. It will be a bad, destructive path for yourself. Don't go that way. It will be hard for you. It will be wrong for yourself. The choices that you were making are not the correct ones. Nevertheless, he chose them. So what he's saying here is that sometimes we, in the world's eyes, are a perfect man, a perfect family. We are doing all the correct choices, but within myself, God's eyes, right? God's laws is written in our own conscience. How am I seeing myself through God's eyes, through this law of God, the law of love, the law of liberty or freedom that comes together with the law of responsibility? How am I seeing myself, seeing my life, seeing my actions? And that's what Otávio wants to convey here. And here comes the meaning of the name Acelino, which is one that agrees. So it is very interesting that Acelino means one that agrees, but he is always trying to get an agreement with what the other person is saying, but using words that show the opposite, that he kind of agrees, but he always has something to say. Let's see, he starts this sentence by saying, but let's be reasonable. So he's saying, I agree with you, however, let's be reasonable. You lost the match because you didn't even play, whereas I lost it by playing disastrously. So it is interesting that he is trying to boost, right, the self-esteem of Otávio here, but at the same time, he is almost, I'm not saying that he is, but it is almost as he's telling the story from a self-pity way. And we already know when we studied pity or self-pity on No Solar in our home, in our previous program, right? Not in the previous episode of this program, but in No Solar in our home, the study of the book No Solar, that self-pity is detrimental, that we cannot go down that path. Because if we go down that path, we will go darker and darker within ourselves, and we may fall into melancholy, into depression. And how this shows us that Acelino is actually somebody just like us. So we really need to pay attention to what he did and to what he is doing, so that we don't fall in the same traps as he did. And this is the rule for this part of the book, where we are seeing us, seeing ourselves in these characters, because we have similar problems, we have similar difficulties, some in one area, some in a different area, right? We just saw Otávio last chapter. He had a problem with his sexuality, the problem that he was not supposed to get married because it was not his program, but he got married. He was supposed to help other children, and he didn't help those children, so he left everything behind. Here, Acelino's story, he says, oh, I agree with you, but my situation is much worse. So that shows as if he is always trying to win a contest over who suffers more or who did more wrong. Is this something that we should be doing? So this is a reflection that's actually not in the book in itself, but it's something that we need to pay attention, because sometimes, and we studied this also in the book No Solar, when we always try to want to know more about other people's situations so that we feel pity for them, and there are a few stories in No Solar where we talk about this. So, but coming back here, and he says, Acelino keeps going, and he says that he went through 11 years of torment in the lower zones. Okay, and your situation, Otávio, didn't demand such drastic measures. Even so, I trust in providence. So it is as if he is trying to win, trying to show that he already knows and he already trusts in the providence while you don't trust. So even though I suffered more, now I know more than you. So it is something that we really need to pay attention, because knowledge and knowing more and having this more doesn't make me better or worse than the other. It shows that I am still at the same level. And here Vicente interrupts. Vicente is a different kind of spirit, although close to us also, but he is a different kind of spirit. And he interrupts so that we can see that there needs to be an interruption here. Each one of us, Vicente says, has had to experience what was appropriate for him. Not everyone succeeds in their trials on earth. And we all need to have trust in God. We all need, and we agree that we all have to have trust in providence. For some people, it may be hard or harder than for other people. But some other parts, some other types of trust or some types of action may be easier for me than for you, in the opposite, the same. Some things may be easier for you and not so easy for me. And that's what maybe Acelino was not seeing here. That Otávio was hard for him, that situation. Maybe it was not for him the problem that Acelino has with money. And Acelino didn't have the problem with sexuality, but he had the problem with money. And Otávio didn't have maybe the problem with the money, but he had the problem with the sexuality. So for each one of us is a different type of problem. And that's what Vicente is telling us here. Everyone has to experience what is appropriate. Because maybe I already conquered that, that vanity or that problem that I had. And I don't need to go through that kind of test, of exam, to show that I already know that how to solve that problem in my life. But maybe I need to go through the trial of not having money and see what I'm going to be doing with my life when I have a lot of money that looks like it's a free money, but it belongs to somebody else. Will I take it or will I not take it? So each one of us has a different kind of trial. And maybe that's what Acelino was not getting here. But Vicente turns around and shows us again that for each one of us is different. Acelino and Otávio are talking here about mediumship. We'll talk here about mediumship in Acelino's case. So he turns to us. Actually, he turns to Andre, right? Andre says, and Vicente, turning to him, specifically explained. as doctors, and Vicente was a doctor, we remember, right? How many of us have failed regretfully in the struggle? So what Vicente is calling us here is, hey, you may not be a doctor, you may not be a medium, but you may be a lawyer, you may be an engineer, you may be a cook, you may be a person who delivers stuff, you may be a teacher, you may be a caretaker of child or of adult people, of older people. We all have our struggles, independently of what the problem or of what the specific problem is. We all have the struggles. And how are we going? How are we doing on our missions, quote unquote, here in life? Are we failing or are we succeeding? That reminds us of what Telesforo was talking to us a few chapters ago, right? Are we failing or are we able to go ahead and fulfill at least part of our deeds, of the deeds that we agreed upon before incarnating here? And Andres says, after agreeing and recalling my own case, he countered. So here's the word agree, right? In Acelino, and this chapter is about agreeing, disagreeing, thinking about our situation. Agreeing and recalling his own case. And he agrees, but he says, nevertheless, it would be interesting to hear Acelino's experience. Was it the same as Otávio? Because these lessons that I'm taking now are very worthwhile. Because while incarnated, he says, he didn't have a good grasp on spiritual duty. So his situation was a doctor, and he was not a churchgoer, as we say sometimes. So he was not aware of all this. But when he gets to No Solar, the perspective changes. So we have to think about our eternal future. So it is interesting to see other people's lives not with the eyes of a judge, but with the eyes of a person who wants to learn from other people's mistakes and from what other people did correct in their lives and how they achieved what they achieved, or if they did something wrong, or if they did something that resulted in something bad on their lives, that we know what went wrong so that we don't repeat the same mistake, right? So that we try in a different way. At this time, Acelino smiles and replies that his story is quite different, that his downfall has different characteristics, and again, from his point of view, was much more serious. So he still thinks, and who am I to agree or to disagree with him, right? But his situation is really dire also, because like many of us, we tend to sometimes choose poorly with what we really have in our own hands, to the reach of our hands. So he begins telling his story. And he tells the story that he left No Solar just like Otávio. He had lots of good instructions, and he went on to reincarnate, enriched with blessings. Once again, the words are very, very interesting, right? Enriched, meaning riches. Once again, the metaphor of money, of material riches. And one of the distinguished ministers in communication presided personally over the measures related to his new task. So he was a spirit, or he is a spirit, who had the knowledge that was necessary for what he was supposed to do. There was no lack of resources, and he was healthy in the body, and he had mental stability. So he promised a lot of things, just like we all do, right? And he left. He reincarnated to serve in one of the large cities of Brazil. On his program, he was supposed to get married to Ruth, who was a devoted companion, which is also very interesting because Ruth means friend. there's a book in the Bible that's named after Ruth, and Ruth, means from Hebrew friend and companion, and that's what is said right after the name Ruth here. Ruth, my devoted companion. So that we can see how these names are chosen here with a purpose. Right? So Ruth was a devoted companion, and she took it upon herself to work with him, to work with Acelino, to accomplish their tasks more easily. Naturally here, he only speaks about himself. He doesn't say anything about Ruth per name, right? Per se, saying that she did this or she did that, but she was his devoted companion. And so she was there to give him advice, to say yes or no, to tell him stuff. And although he doesn't mention her by name after here, but he says sometimes that there were some friends around him that would advise him in the contrary, but he kept doing what he wanted to do. He got stuck within himself with his own ideas, and he didn't listen to the exterior world. So I really believe that Ruth, at these moments, she was actively trying to convince him of not doing what he was supposed to do. But that's just my call in some of these words. Once again, saying that Ruth means companion, means friend. So he's going to talk about friends later on, and we will see if you can see that Ruth may be in this, amidst this group of friends that he says, and that he tells us that they were trying to show him that he was wrong. And then he goes on and he says that after finishing the first part of the plan at age 20, so what he's pointing to us here is that when our incarnation is planned, there are some parts of the plan that will be from, early childhood, and then teenager years, and then early adulthood, and then the adulthood where we really will start doing what we are supposed to do, some earlier, some a little later. But he followed through the plan. Okay, at least that's what we understand here. And he was called to mediumistic work and received a lot of support from the invisible benefactors. And he still remembered the sincere satisfaction of his colleagues in the study group. And if we are going to a Spiritist center and we go to study groups independently, if it's a mediumship study group or a regular study group, a Spiritist study group, study of the gospel or study of Spiritism in general, once we really have a good group together, if we, for some reason, move out, go to a different place, and we go back in time and remember that group, if we really had a good group, we will remember that group as a very powerful moment in our lives because of the support, of the laughter, of how much we learned at that moment. So he is here talking about, naturally, the mediumistic group, and he's saying that at that moment, with all the support and all the satisfaction and all the joy that he was having, that they were having together, then the clairvoyant, clairaudient, and psychographic faculties that he was supposed to receive because of the type of work that he was set up to do, he started receiving them. So he could hear the spirits, that's the clairaudient faculty, and he could see the spirits, that's the clairvoyant faculty, and the psychographic faculties, the psychographic faculty is the faculty or the mediumship where the spirit can write through you and give us messages, just like this book was psychographed by Chico Xavier, through the hands of Chico Xavier, right, by the spirit Andre Lewis. So those are the three types of faculties of mediumship that Acelino had, and these were supposed to really be used to help other people, to help people that would go to the spirit group, the Spiritist group that he would be working on, or if not a spiritist group, anywhere that he was working with the mediumship that he was supposed to have. Although at this moment, in this book, and Acelino didn't mention by name, but we can clearly see, because there's a study group studying mediumship and so on, that's much, much more common. It's rare outside of Spiritism to have a study group studying about mediumship, following the guidelines that Kardec set up on the books of codification, especially on the medium's book. So we can assume here that this is a spiritist group that he's talking about. And everyone was filled with unsurpassable joy, as usually it is in these groups, because once you start studying and we start putting these teachings into practice, and we see that people are being helped, are being consoled, are being comforted, we have that kind of joy, because it is good to see a brighter light in the eyes of other people who are feeling stronger to deal with the problems in their own lives. So, and then he starts again with another however, in spite of wonderful lessons regarding evangelical love, he says, right, I was inclined to turn my faculties into a source of material income. So he had that inclination, he had that tendency to use and as we said from the beginning, right, from the start, from the get-go, all the words that he used tend to have that connotation of material income. So it was a tendency for him, it is still a tendency for him, one that he really needs to work upon, to change, to really modify within himself. So that's what he is saying here. He knows himself, or at least now. At that moment, he wasn't completely aware that he needed to control that. Maybe he was, but he was not putting the efforts to control, right? And then he says that he wasn't willing to wait for the abundant financial resources that the Lord was going to send me after I had proven myself and I looked to solve my own financial problems. So, and then at this moment, he says, okay, the program for my life was work in the Spiritist Center, doing what you need there to do, and work with your own life, right? Have your own work, and after you prove that you're not going to use the mediumship to gain money, you're going to receive what you need to keep going. However, he chose the other path with interesting questions, right? With interesting philosophical questions. Asking, for example, wasn't my work the same as others? Weren't Catholic priests paid for their spiritual and religious work? So he looks at himself as a priest, and then he says, okay, the Catholic Church does this. Why can't I do this? So he uses an excuse, right, of looking upon another religion and saying, okay, they are doing, so I can do it. We're not saying that it's wrong or it's right. Right? What we're saying is, and what he is trying to convey to us here is, pay attention. The others may be examples, but if we follow the example, it is my responsibility on what I am doing. We cannot judge the others and say, you are right or you are wrong. But once I do it, I will judge myself. My conscience will judge myself on what I am doing. So we are not condemning or judging the people who, what we are trying to think about here is why we are doing. Right? It's not who, but why do I do it? This is the very and most important question that we need to ask. What is the motive behind it? And what am I selling if I am charging for something? Because I may, for example, because I know that this topic to some people is disruptive, is controversial, but the thought behind it, it's not necessarily and only about the money, but about the motives of what I am doing. Because, for example, I may not charge 1 penny for any type of spiritual work that I do. Any penny. But let's just imagine a person that I just gave a message, for example, and was never charged for anything, didn't even need to give a cup of water. The person never thanks the medium, for example. And not only never thanks the medium, but comes at a later time and lashes out bad words and complains and start telling stories about the medium. What am I going to feel about it? How am I going to be receiving those messages, those complaints? If I am, and here is what is our thinking about this. If a medium is expecting anything in return from what they are doing, this is charging for their work. Some people are more upfront and charge money for it, but maybe we are still charging them for their good emotional response from the work that I am providing. Am I charging this? Are we charging emotionally, an emotional response, an emotional money from the person that the medium is providing the work or the consolation to that person? So his thoughts here have that image behind it, but he goes on and charges it financially. So it's not the mere thought of the money in itself, but it's what's below the surface, which is really, really important. But his logic is, if we all have to pay for the needs of the body, why shouldn't we be paid for providing the needs of the soul? Right? So if a person needs help, why can't I charge to help that person? And he says, my friends were ignorant of the sacred nature of faith, so they went along with my selfish conclusions. And here he says, right, my friends were ignorant. So maybe they were together, just like Ruth, and the ones who were ignorant of the sacred nature of faith, they agreed with those explanations. And they all believed that discarnates were behind the essence of our work, but still, his personal collaboration as an intermediary was part of that work, for which payment would be appropriate. So he disguises, right, the idea that, okay, I'm not receiving for the spirits because the spirits were the essence, but I have a body and I need the money. So it's his personal, his, and he uses this my. And so he's charging for the work that he is doing at that moment. His spirit friends, he goes on, rushed to point out a better way, but to no avail. So he was receiving messages through his own mediumship, telling him, these good spirits, those friends, rushing to him and showing that there's a better way of doing this. Don't do this. This is not the right path to go, but to no avail. He didn't respond to that. In vain, he goes on, my incarnate friends demanded an explanation. This demanded an explanation here, and I'd like to point out the Portuguese version of the book, because first, the word that he uses here, friends, in Portuguese, in this very specific place, the word that's used here is companion. And if we remember, right, when we were talking about Ruth, he says, Ruth, my companion. So In this moment here, at this very moment here, I can clearly see at least that he is including Ruth among those companions that wanted him to pay attention, to pay more attention to the messages that he was receiving. Right? So why are you doing differently than what the messages are saying to you? The messages are saying here, don't do this. This is not the best way of going. Look, we are pointing out a better way, but you're not doing it. These were the companions who were pointing out to him. He didn't listen. He clung, as he says, to his inferior interests and stuck to his own point of view. As we keep saying, we have the free will. We can choose. And that's what he chose. He would work only for paying clients. He decided to charge for consultations. So he was already charging. And aren't we all, to some degree, as we just reflected upon? What are we charging? That's what we need to think about. Are we charging something? And naturally, in spiritist groups, we don't charge anything. That's not part of what we believe, and that's not part of what our modus operandi works in a spiritist group. Nothing is charged. Absolutely nothing. Financially. However, are we charging anything? What are the types of, quote unquote here, spiritual money that we are charging other people? Are we or aren't we? There's something very interesting here. He says that he decided to charge for consultations, but he was so aware of the problem that he thought of the poor, and he decided, well, some people don't have the same amount of money that I am charging, and I'm going to create special rates for those who are poor and are unfortunate. So I am going to be charitable here. Look, there's a lot of things for us to think about this in our own lives. Is it how we think? Is this the way that we think? That the poor can pay something and the rich can pay more? How am I thinking about this when we see a person in the Spiritist Center? This is something for us to think about. Not charging, because I'm pretty sure that nobody that's listening to this charges anything from anybody in a Spiritist Center. But we need to think about this with very, very good care. And he says, and he describes, right, the consultation room filled up with people, a lot of interest, a lot of people coming to solve the solutions to their problems and the material affairs, most of it. Large number of wealthy families took me on as their regular consultant for all their life problems. However, lessons regarding higher spirituality, friendly fellowship, redemptive work for the gospel, and teachings by divine emissaries were left along the wayside. Isn't it sometimes how we all do? Right? When we tend to focus on the material life, we unfocus from the spiritual life. So if we are trying more and more to solve material problems, the spiritual life comes like a sideways, and unfortunately, since we are incarnated, usually we are more aroused by the materiality than the spirituality. The school of virtue, he says, fraternal love, and higher edification no longer counted. He forgot everything about it. He simply didn't pay attention to these things anymore because he was worried about his financial problems, the material side of what he needed to do to survive. And he was not having his, well, at least he doesn't say anything about it. It is as if he was using the mediumship to have the money to support himself and to support the family. But with this, a lot of other things start coming our way, or started coming his way. Instead of these virtues, the fraternal love and the higher edification, business competition, legal or criminal relationships, passionate whims, police cases, and a grand procession of humankind's miseries in their least worthy expressions were what mattered. So he was so involved in these material passions that the landscape of the spirit world that encircled him was completely transformed by himself, right? By the choice that he made on how to use his mediumship, on how to behave using the faculty that he received from the spiritual world. By surrounding himself with criminals for monetary gain, the inferior mental currents of his troubled clients had incarcerated him in a dark psychic dungeon. So he was encircled by spirits, as we all are, but he is a medium. The mediumship was not removed from him, but instead of receiving good spirits, because he encircled himself with a lot of bad stories, with thinking of only, right, with the main goal of himself, of receiving the material gain from that. Although he may be helping some people, right, he doesn't want to be an evil person. He will say that, and Vicente will say that also in a few minutes. But what was his goal? His goal was not to provide good, but his goal was to receive something from the ones who he were trying to help. Things were so bad for him, mentally and psychologically and spiritually, that he even committed the crime of ridiculing the gospel of Jesus. He doesn't know specifically what he said, what he did, but it is as if, okay, I don't need this, I have this ability, I have this faculty, I can use it, I don't need this gospel, I'm just going to start giving advice, and this is the money that I want. So he, as he said, right, he forgot everything. The school of virtue, fraternal love, and higher education. It's not for that I have the mediumship. That was his thought. So I really don't care about this. But with this, and he says, he was overlooking the fact that illicit business dealings with those who have corrupt scruples also entail involvement with evil spirits. Where your heart is, right? As Dorothy says in The Wizard of Oz, our home is where our heart is. If my heart is in the evil business, my home will be where evil is. If my heart is connected to the good, what encircles me is the good, right? As Jesus says in one specific moment to Peter, and I tend to see, and I see that teaching of Jesus to Peter, as if he is talking specifically to us, is Matthew 16, chapter 16, when he on verse 19, he says to Peter that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you lose on earth will be loosed in heaven. This is the New International Version translation of the Bible. So what Jesus is looking at us and saying to us here is that if you tie yourself here on earth to evil, once we die, we are tied, we are bound to evil. That's the teaching. Whatever we do here, it will not be removed simply because I trust in this or I believe in that. No. It's my connection. My connection is to bad spirits, to illicit business dealings with those who have corrupt scruples. Once I die, this will make me involved with the same types of spirits, with the same type of people. It's just when we discarnate, they don't have their bodies anymore, their physical bodies, but they are still spirits, and they are still the same as I am going to be, still the same. And he finalizes by saying, I had transformed mediumship into a source of material hunches and cheap advice, destroying completely the main task of mediumship, which is to console and comfort those who are in need of help and of fraternal advice, higher edification, and improvement in the school of virtue. He transformed completely the idea of what mediumship is. And then Andre interrupts a little bit to tell us that because of the remembrance of the story at this very moment on how Acelino is remembering, he sees Acelino's eyes turn to red, revealing unfathomable horror in their pupils, as if he were reliving an atrocious torment. He is reliving because once we remember, we relive what we lived at that moment. And if it is true for us here, while incarnated, sometimes we remember something and our heartbeats goes up, our heartbeats go up or down. We have those, when we see something, what we are thinking affects our material body. Can you imagine what our thoughts and how they affect us as spirits without the body? Death came, Acelino says, and tore him from his delusion. When the transition came, at that moment, a large group of criminal clients who had preceded him to the grave, surrounded him, demanding suggestions and guidance of a lower nature. That's what he was doing there. Right? He was a medium. He was providing counseling. The spirits were around and surrounding him at all times. He discarnated. The same spirits who were surrounding him kept surrounding him, were still surrounding him. They wanted news about incarnate accomplices and business results. What you bind here on earth, as we just read, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you lose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's the translation that I have here right in front of me. So they demanded solutions regarding clandestine connection. Who am I binding myself to here in my work, in my mind? And if we are mediums working in a spiritist center, what am I doing? What are the connections that I am making to those spirits who are coming to those meetings? This is something that when we see it through Acelino's eyes, we can clearly see how hard it can be if we are not really trying, putting effort to change the way we still are. Hopefully, I'm just saying this so that we can remember the story and that know that we are not doing this. Right? Hopefully, almost completely certain that I'm not saying this to somebody who is living this in their own life. And he says, to finalize this first part, I screamed, Acelino says, right? I screamed, wept, implored, but I was shackled to them by sinister mental chains because of my negligence in defending my spiritual heritage. He shackled himself. He is bound now by what he created on earth, created mentally, psychologically, and spiritually. He disregarded his spiritual heritage by attaching himself to these spirits. It's not that the spirits were influencing him. He wanted to do it because he thought it was okay to do it. That's his choice. And then once we start going a certain pathway, spirits will look at me and say, okay, this guy is going this pathway. I also want to go this pathway. Why don't I join him or her on the pathway that he chose? And then we start influencing each other. And I can't now, at this very moment, defend my spiritual heritage, my knowledge, simply because it becomes harder and harder to get out of the situation. It's not impossible, it's just harder. But now he died, so he couldn't defend until the moment when he was able to really reach deep inside of himself, maybe like Andre did. He suffered so much, and at one moment he decided, oh, I don't want to be here anymore. But it's not that superficial repentance, but the inner recognition that I need help. So for 11 years, he says, he expiated his wrongdoings among them, among those people, those spirits, amidst remorse and bitterness. So he was remorseful, and he was bitter. Why? Maybe because he now started to see how badly he chose his pathway. And he was crying at this moment. And because he was crying, he was silent, and he seemed even more distraught. Vicente was deeply touched, and he says, oh, don't beat yourself up like that. You didn't commit any murders, nor did you nourish any deliberate intentions to spread evil. The way I see it, you too deceived yourself like so many of us. Here comes Vicente, not agreeing with him, showing him a different way of seeing this, the same way he started by saying to Otavio, you didn't do that bad, you didn't kill anybody, you didn't have the intention to spread evil. So you deceived yourself, just like we do at all times. There's so many times we do this. And he finalizes by showing who he still is, and making us reflect, who are we? Who am I? And who am I to judge anybody? He starts his sentence with a negative word, which is very saying to me. Once we think that Acelino means one that agrees. Even when he agrees, because he is agreeing here that he was not a murderer or a common thief, and that he didn't have an inner desire to hurt anyone or to disrespect the homes of others. But he starts by, no, I wasn't a murderer. Even when he is disagreeing, he has this certain kind or this certain tone of negativity in the way he speaks, in the way he behaves himself. Do we have that same tone? How do we start our sentences? How do we agree or disagree with other people? This is something for us to think about, because we are social beings. We have a lot of interactions with other people. And while we are working in a Spiritus Center, there's no Spiritus Center that's made out of one person. So we all deal with each other. How is our negativity influencing the way we talk to other people? So he agrees. Acelino agrees with Vicente. Yeah, he was not a murderer. I was not a murderer or a common thief. But he doesn't say yeah. He says, no, I wasn't a murderer or a common thief. And he says, after agreeing, but, and he finalizes with a but I went to the physical realm to serve God's creatures, our brothers and sisters, alongside Jesus, in order to help them with their spiritual growth. But I only made addicts of religious belief and occult delinquents who were mutilated in their faith and crippled in their thought. He is learning to know himself. He looks at his mistakes and he says, I made mistakes. This is great, and this is for all of us to take this example. We need to learn to think of ourselves as people, spirits, who are in our pathway to perfection. That if we are in that pathway, it means that we still have a lot to conquer within ourselves. That we need to have perseverance. We need to struggle to win over our own deficiencies. And that's what he is recognizing here. Agreeing and disagreeing, going back and forth just the way we are. He has no excuse, he says. I have no excuse because I knew better. This is tough and hard on us. Do we know better? Do we have a knowledge to understand and look upon ourselves and say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be doing that instead. We are being called upon by messages, by spiritist talks, by examples set out in the world, not only by spiritists, but by great people from all different kinds of cultures and religions. We have access to this huge amount of examples from around the world. Do we know better than we knew and then he knew when he was incarnated? So why, when we look at Acelino, and I'm here, and I'm saying we, but I'm thinking about myself, when I look at Acelino, why do I have this feeling of judgment, of being judgmental towards him, thinking that he was so bad, and agreeing with him, which is very, very interesting once again. I have no excuse because I knew better. I can't be forgiven, for I didn't lack divine assistance. Can he be forgiven? Of course he can. But why do we tend to agree with him when he says that? If we think that, won't we think that we can't be forgiven? We have to be careful, though, of course, that sometimes you say, oh, I can be forgiven by God on everything that I do, and I can, and I will be forgiven because God is love, so he actually doesn't even need, God doesn't even need to forgive us because there's no need to forgive us. But once we think that, sometimes, and some people think that, okay, I can do anything because there will be no consequence, or we don't think about the consequences, and that's not what we want to convey here. When he says that I can't be forgiven is the idea that I won't have to do anything else, and that's not what forgiveness is about. Forgiveness is, okay, there's no problem, I still love you, but if you took this from that person, you have to give that thing back to that person because it doesn't belong to you. That has nothing to do with forgiveness. That has to do with responsibility and consequence on what I am doing. So what he's saying here is that he has no excuse because he knew better. I agree with that, but he can be forgiven. He can be forgiven. He is forgiven, but he will, just like us, we will be called upon the choices that we made so that we give back what we took that didn't belong to us. And we will still have a lot of divine assistance, just like he did, and just like we are having and we are receiving right now at this very moment. And to finalize, after a long pause, he concludes gravely, asking us a question. Now, can you see how guilty I am? And the answer, at least on my side, is yes, I can see how guilty he is. But the question to ourselves is, how guilty are we of what we are doing? How guilty am I? And what am I doing with that guilt? Am I getting stuck even further down on what I believe and on, oh, I'm just the poor guy who God does this to me? Or am I the one who says, oh, I am guilty, but I am going to work so that I can remove that guilty by doing and giving back what I took from society, what I took from that people, what I took from that person, and even further, what I took from myself. What did I take from myself that I couldn't even defend my spiritual heritage? See, the word heritage, again, showing how much Acelino was connected to this idea of riches, of the material that needed, the material riches needed to support himself, connected to the spirituality that he has and that we have. As Jesus teaches us, we cannot have two gods. We either serve God or Mammon. Mammon representing the idea of the material life being more important than the spiritual life. The money that we have is more important than the spiritual life that we need to learn to live at all times, while incarnated or discarnated. So hopefully we can look at Acelino's story, see not see him within ourselves in terms of this terrible rush of looking for material riches, of becoming wealthy and using the spirituality of our spirituality or the spirituality of other people to become rich. Hopefully, we are not in that point anymore. And if we are not on that struggle anymore, let's go deep down and think about, what am I expecting in return from what we are giving and doing to other people? Because one day we will really see and feel that the power of love is really and only the power of the moment when I give independently if I receive something back from that good that I just did. May we work within ourselves together with our friends and companions, our good friends and companions, so that we can learn this as fast as we can, but also as deep as we can, so that we can feel happier and happier by actively helping others to become happier. And then we will get rid of all the guilt that we may carry. May you all, together with us, have a great week. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to Kardec Radio, broadcasting live every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email us and share your comments at www.kardecradio.com. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.